What are we whispering about?
We have to remember, ultimately, when you go back a long way, that the word fairy didn't refer to creatures, however you want to term them, at all. The word fairy referred to the believed supernatural realm in which other things happened. Fairy was only attributed to a diminutive winged or not winged or whatever creature much later on. So even at the beginning we have ambiguity in this, because fairies weren't fairies. Fairy was a place, a supernatural place.
I went into the woods, I took a photo. There's a big oak tree that arches over this big stone at the edge of the wood. So I'd taken some photos of that and some photos of what I saw within the wood as well. Then later that night I went home and I posted my photos on the Facebook group that I belonged to that was related to the fairy workshop that I'd been doing. Somebody in the group said, "Oh, there's a little figure in the tree above the stone." And I had a look, and sure enough, to me, this looked like, made of the shadow and light, it looked like a little person that would have been about maybe a foot tall or so, stood on one of the branches of the tree above the stone and pointing to where I'd picked up the trash. In the air, by the sea, from the land, and within you and me. Fairies are whispering. Have you been coloured, confused, completely captivated, and craving clarity? This is Claire Casely, and I am a fairy whisperer. To catch a whisper, you have to listen closely. Listen with me. Hello and welcome. How are you this evening? Before I introduce my guest for this episode, I wanted to share something about my inspiration for this podcast. When I first started recording people's stories about their fairy experiences and the supernatural back in 2020 during lockdown, I just knew that I had to record these stories for others to hear and share and feel some validation. And because I'd had my own experiences, which I wanted to find some answers for. I've been podcasting in a focused way since 2022. And before that, I've had my YouTube channel recording my journeys through the landscape and connections with fairies. A part of that journey that's been very important to me are the stories from the local area that I live in Devon. I grew up hearing about the local folklore from my grandfather and from teachers who probably introduced me to Devon folklore. I've always had a passion for the unexplained and the supernatural because I have a connection to that world that I can't really explain, and that has intrigued me all of my life. I enjoy storytelling, and my approach to this podcast has always been to showcase my guests' stories in a way that brings validation to them and to others who might be listening. And storytelling is really important to me, especially as an artist. All of my life I've told stories through painting pictures, drawing pictures, and so taking my creative work into this spoken form has been really important to me as a way of giving voice to those stories that would otherwise stay silent. My guest for this episode is Mark Norman, who is a folklorist and archivist of the Devon Folklore Library in Crediton. I visited the library in the summer as part of my research for my Pixie book that is almost complete. It's taken me over 4 years of research and writing, and I'm really proud of it. A few years ago, Mark asked me to submit some of my Faerie experiences to the Folklore Library, which I did. I've decided to include those recordings in this episode. I've edited them for the purpose of putting them out on the podcast, and just because they were very raw, and I recorded them on my phone, and I wanted to present them in a way that was more easy to listen to and incorporate some elements of audio to help tell the story. So woven into my fascinating chat with Mark are the recordings that I sent to him 2 or 3 years ago. These recordings can be accessed online by anyone. I will put the link in the notes of this show on the podcast blog, www.thefaeriewhispering.com, and also as a link in the description for the show. I hope that these recordings also help to illustrate the reason for my fascination with fairies and creating this podcast, which I love. I am sure you will enjoy this episode. I'm really delighted to welcome my guest Mark Norman today. He's a folklore researcher and author based in the UK. He hosts the Folklore Podcast, curates the Folklore Library in Crediton in Devon, which is also, some of it's online as well. I'm sure Mark will share about that in a moment. And Mark is a member of the Folklore Society and teaches courses online about folklore. Welcome, Mark.
Hello.
Hi. Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd love to know how your interest in folklore and this whole area of study began.
I think it's probably down to a couple of things, to be honest. I think it's partly down to the area in which I live, in Devon, in the southwest of the UK, which is one of those kind of rural spurs of the country where what the newspapers like to term quaint folklore and traditions and things like that kind of survive a lot more easily than they do in more urbanized areas, perhaps. And I'm very much a kind of country person in that way, I guess. But also it probably started tangentially, as I think it probably does for a lot of people at school, with more of an interest in what we term the paranormal. now rather than anything else. So school libraries were great for a whole bunch of reasons, but they were great because they had these lovely collections of books by Usborne and various other prolific children's publishers on these subjects, which were very, very, when you look back at them now, and obviously Usborne have been republishing their Mysteries of the Unexplained in similar series recently, kind of 50 years on from when those of us of a particular age first read them. And they're actually, when you look back at them through adult eyes, they're very, very well written, well researched, well presented, and very engaging. So I think lots of people at that time became interested in those sorts of subjects, ghosts and monsters, fairies, and all that kind of thing. And then I suspect that interest probably waned as people grew up for some, and for others it kind of stuck around. And I carried on being interested in that sort of area. I used to sort of collect newspaper reports and things like that for the Fortean Times, for example. Did some collecting for them. I wrote some bits and pieces, and that kind of interest then, as my interest in history developed, kind of spread slightly from the paranormal, which is less of an interest for me in many ways these days, to folklore, because there's a lot of crossover. And I was particularly interested in the history of this area, Devon, where I live, and social history and all those sorts of aspects. And folklore is nothing if not social history at the end of the day. And it was kind of a natural progression to move then, I think, from the kind of more esoteric, occulty, paranormal-y subjects across to the kind of more traditional, customary, belief-based stories and lore that I work with now, which still have all of that original interest underneath them, I guess.
That's really interesting. You started off with the esoteric and have moved gradually more into this area of study.
Because when you're young, that's what interests you more, isn't it? Yeah. History's dull at school. You only find out that history's interesting actually later on when you come out of the curriculum and look at it your own way.
Definitely. And a lot of the ghost stories I used to tell my friends at school, I'm now learning the history of those through wonderful collections like the one that you manage in Crediton. Why is folklore important then, Mark?
Well, folklore is important because it's part of everybody's everyday life. You don't necessarily think about it straight out like that, but you interact with it many times every day without necessarily realizing it. You know, if you have little family rituals that you follow, if you follow any kind of superstitious belief at all, whether you actually believe it or not, you don't walk under a ladder, you salute a magpie, you throw salt over your shoulder, any of these sorts of things, then that's what you're interacting with. But crucially, I guess folklore is important for us as people because it's what gives us our identity. So folklore is a language in many ways. It's a language of symbolism. It's a language of meaning, these sorts of things. And obviously that's very culturally relevant depending on where you are. So something might mean something a little bit different to someone who lives in another country or another county or another region, but it's part of what gives them their sense of identity, their sense of belonging in a community. We talk about folk groups, those groups of people who share common interests, whether that's knitting and craft work, or whether it's something else, following a particular sports team, following a particular music group, whatever. They're all folk groups. They're where we share our interests. And all of that comes under the same sphere, and it helps us to understand our place in the world, what things mean to us. And folklore serves many purposes like that. So we have stories in folklore that have developed as warnings to keep away from dangerous areas. We have stories in folklore that teach us right from wrong. We have morality tales, particularly coming out of Edwardian and Victorian folklore collecting periods, for example, those sorts of things. But underneath it all, it's what makes us us.
Mm. And you're very interested in encouraging people to collect folklore, aren't you, with your project? So how can people on an everyday basis start to record and collect folklore, say family stories, and where can they share this information?
Well, anywhere that kind of houses collections of traditional material. I speak for the Folklore Library and Archive because that is our purpose. There are plenty of other places that do the same thing. And lots of archives for more local history-based stuff do the same thing as well. It's vital to kind of record this stuff for the future for many different reasons, because, as I say, this material tells us who we are. It helps us to understand us and our world, and then in the future, obviously, it allows people to understand why things changed and developed the way they did, why people do particular things. And there are loads of ways that you can do that as well. So, you don't have to set out to think, okay, I'm going to actively collect folklore and go out into the field and interview people. You can absolutely do those things, but you don't have to. You can do it on an individual ad hoc basis. If you go to the pub on a Wednesday night and there's a Morris dance team dancing in the car park, take some photos, take some video, and then submit it to people who house those sorts of collections. And the Folklore Library and Archive exists for this purpose. So unlike a lot of places where you need to get through paywalls to access particular materials, or you need to pay for this, that, and the other, that's not the remit of the Folklore Library and Archive. It's a charity. And our charitable constitutional remit is to collect and preserve traditional materials for the future, for the benefit of the public generally, but crucially to make them freely available through open access. So you do not have to pay to access our materials. You can request materials and have free access to, we like people to give a donation because we're a charity, and we won't keep going if people don't do that, but you don't have to. And that's the difference. So, it's just a case of going, okay, here are some things that I did. And you send them in, and you can email them in or whatever. And then somebody might say, or just tell us where it was and when it was. And then we add it to the archive to benefit everybody. You don't even have to actively go out and do it. Everybody has collections of family photos. Within those collections of family photos, there are inevitably going to be photos of carnivals and fetes and fairs and all of those traditional things from years ago that your grandparents or your parents went to. And anything like that is of interest. If there are stories within your family that are of interest, jot them down and send them in an email, record conversations with family members on your phone and send in voice clips, anything like that. It's all grist to the mill. It's all preservation of these materials, and that's the vital thing, because we have so many cases of people who used to actively collect material who pass away. They make no provision for what's going to happen to that material, and then inevitably it gets lost, and so much important material has gone that way, and what we're trying to do is prevent that in the future.
Yeah, that's so important. I mean, I'm very aware of that with my family and some of my episodes. I've recorded my father talking about stories from his family, like the hairy hands. So yeah, it's really great. I mean, I'm just thinking now, there are things that I could send you.
Well, yeah, and indeed you already have, because you've sat down and recorded as an audio clip some of your stories in the past and emailed them in, and now they're in the Folklore Library archives and digitized and online, and anybody can go and listen to them. And yeah, anybody can do it, and it's dead easy.
Hi Mark, it's Claire. I'm just looking through my first fairy journal that I created back in June 2016 to record fairy experiences. I should explain that in 2016 I reconnected with the fairies. I've always had a connection with them through my art and the landscape of Dartmoor. I've always sensed something else, an unseen spirit, I suppose, of the moor. And I created fairy art from the time that I left university, so about 1995. And even though as a child I'd always played outside and felt a presence, I only really started to identify with that as fairy when I became interested in fairies in my 20s. Actually, prior to that maybe a little bit, but also when I left university, and then had an on and off connection with them, and then went into the corporate world. I worked as an art teacher and then I worked as an IT trainer, and just longed to be out in nature again. And then my health suffered, and around 2000, it was early 2013, I decided that because of my health I was going to leave the corporate world. I left my job. I was a single parent at that point, and I was diagnosed with ME, so I basically burnt out. And as part of my recovery from that, I got back into doing my art, my writing and walking in nature. And subsequently, in 2016, I reconnected with the fairies by doing a very short online course. Then from that point on, I made a commitment to working with the fairies and to working with nature. So, before I recount these stories, I should just say I'm not taking any form of medication. I live a very healthy, balanced life. At the moment, I'm full-time mum to my children. I'm a carer. My daughter is on the autistic spectrum. And I'm also a carer to other family members. So, being with nature and connecting with the other world is very much part of my well-being. So going back to, I'm going to start with June 2016. This is the 2nd of June, and I'd made a journal, the first journal I'd ever made, which I dedicated to recording my experiences in nature with the fairies. And I was really excited. So the same day that I created this journal, I decided I was going to head off to Wood. It's also under threat at the moment from the increase in people visiting it, especially over the last couple of years during lockdown. So I'm just going to stop there and have a look at my notes. So basically, on the 2nd of June 2016, I set off to Wood, and I had very much as the focus to connect with the fairies there. Prior to going, for a few weeks, I had intuitive feeling. I mean, I'm very sensitive, very intuitive, also clairaudient. I hear sounds, singing, music sometimes. Not all the time, it's just occasionally at very sort of significant times in my life. And I also had received messages. So I had this very clear message from Spirit that I should pick up trash in my neighbourhood, specifically to go to Woods, which is behind my house. It's a 10-minute walk from where I live. And then there's a park that adjoins it that is owned by the local council. And there's a huge amount of people that walk through the park and the woods. And anyway, lots of young people from Newton Abbot use that as a gathering point, go into the woods and have a few drinks and, socialise that way. So, yeah, it can be very littered at times. Anyway, I hadn't done this. I hadn't answered this call. So I went wood. I was walking, it's a couple of miles from the car park. And as I was approaching, getting closer, and I could see the woods appearing in the distance, I started to hear giggling, like children giggling. This is in my clairaudient senses. And I asked telepathically, psychically, where I should go in the woods to sit and commune with the fairies. A voice said to walk clockwise to the far end of the wood. Being a very long, narrow wood, I wondered how far this would be. And they kept urging me on to go to the end of the wood. There you will find the guardian. As I rounded the far end corner, I was amazed to see a large stone that looked similar to the large standing stones at Avebury, which I'd visited in March that year, so I knew what those stones looked like. So it's a huge stone, but it's actually quite an ancient stone that's been there probably since perhaps the Neolithic people, that created the hut circles that are in the area around the woods. So as I looked at this stone, I noticed a smaller stone next to it, and together, to my eyes, they formed a gateway. Beyond the stones, the other side of this gateway, there seemed to be step-like boulders leading down into the woods. I heard this is a portal between worlds. So I asked mentally if I could come into the woods, and then I mentally heard, or psychically heard, another giggle, and they said first initiation. So I noticed then, looking around, I wonder what they meant, but I noticed that they meant to pick up some trash that had been left behind by previous visitors that was behind this large stone. And I brought a black bin liner with me. I quite often carry a bag to pick up trash. I cleared up this rubbish and asked again if I could come in, and the answer was yes. I could go into the wood. I mentally asked where I could sit and write. Immediately my eye was drawn to this circle of 5 trees. I think they were rowan trees around a circle of rocks. And I went and sat down, and as I was sitting there, sort of tuning into the spot, I saw a couple of faces on the trees, which I took to be tree spirits, and they looked very kind and benevolent. And the message was, this is all one. This is all one, was the message. And I felt very, very relaxed there, felt very welcome. And I took a few photos whilst there. On the way into the woods, I took a photo. There's a big oak tree that arches over this big stone at the edge of the wood. So I'd taken some photos of that and some photos of what I saw within the wood as well. Then later that night, I went home and I posted my photos on a Facebook group that I belong to that's related to the Faerie workshop that I'd been doing. somebody in the group said, "Oh, there's a little figure in the tree above the stone." And I had a look, and sure enough, to me, this looked like, made of the shadow and light, it looked like a little person that would have been about maybe a foot tall or so, stood on one of the branches of the tree above the stone and pointing to where I'd picked up the trash. Now with me, I can see this little figure very clearly, and obviously the person that pointed it out could see it as well. I'm not saying that this can be scientifically proven to be a pixie, but with the events that led up to that happening that day, the messages I received to go to that place, the fact that I've had the sense for weeks, been asked by voices to pick up the trash in a park near me, and the fact that when I got there I felt a very clear no, that I couldn't go in, that I had to do this task of picking up some trash, some rubbish that somebody had left behind. By the way, the rubbish that was left behind wasn't very nice. It was basically somebody had gone to the toilet there and left some toilet paper. It's pretty gross, and I picked it up with a couple of sticks and put it in this bag and took the bag home with me, put it in a bin. To me, that was it's almost like, well, you haven't, this is how I interpreted it, well, you haven't done the task we set you of picking up the trash in your local park, therefore this is something a bit more unpleasant for you to do, to be able to come into this wood, because you haven't done the other things that we set you to do. So that's just my kind of interpretation of it. So yeah, since then I drew this pixie, how I could see, I've created a painting of him, and I've had other experiences of wood since then with this particular pixie, with the Fae presence there, the spirit of this place. Another time I was driving across Dartmoor, really beautiful day, and I wanted to go to a crystal shop in Tavistock that I'd heard about. I'd heard it was a good place for nice crystals, and I was driving over, and as I passed two bridges, I heard a voice say malachite. So I took that as an instruction from the Fae there that they wanted some malachite. At the crystal shop, I bought a couple of pieces of malachite and some other crystals. What's some of your favourite folklore, Mark? Is there anything that any areas that really interest you above others that you could share with us?
It's difficult to pin it down precisely, to be honest, because so much of it is of interest. For me personally, I like to work on a local level for much of my research. So I really enjoy collecting and working with Devon folklore, and I had a book published recently last year on folklore Devon. That comes out in paperback actually in October this year as well, in a more affordable format for people who can actually read it, because it's published through a university press, and therefore the hardback was expensive, but that'll be sorted soon. And I love working with stuff in my area, because you can see how stories have moved around and changed and developed far more easily. You can see how it relates to things around you. But at the same time, I have obviously broader interests as well. And lots of people will know that black dog apparitions are one of my particular areas of interest because I hold the archives of most of the sightings of black dog ghosts in the UK, well, and beyond, actually. And that was the subject of my first book. And so that's always been of particular interest, but I don't like to pin it down too much because I find it all fascinating. But if I had to be forced down and told to give one or two examples, then black dogs for sure, because I've been working with that material for years. But particularly regional folklore from my area is a big interest too.
Yeah. Could you share an example of black dog sightings, stories in this part of the world, in Devon?
And there are hundreds. I suppose some are of particular interest because they relate to different things. So after this interview, for example, I've got to go down to Buckfastleigh to film an interview with somebody about Richard Cable, Squire of Buckfastleigh, whose tomb is in Buckfastleigh Old Church graveyard. And that's a very famous black dog story because it most likely was one of the inspirations for Conan Doyle when he wrote The Hound of the Baskervilles. But it's a story that's connected more with the concept of the wild hunt and the kind of more mythological angle. Because essentially it talks about Richard Cable, who was Squire of Buckfastleigh and who was notoriously kind of unpleasant character, and how when he died, black dogs came and bayed at his window for his soul, and all of these kind of mythological aspects. And then the local parishioners bury him in this big altar tomb with a stone on top of him, and to stop his spirit from rising because he's so notoriously unpleasant. Now a lot of this is mythological, a lot of this is metaphorical. But it ties in quite nicely with the concept of the wild hunt and the way that is seen in Devon. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got something like the Black Dog of Torrington, which is a really interesting case because it's a whole series of reported sightings of apparitions of a black dog that follow a path from kind of Morchard Bishop area in mid-Devon right the way through to Torrington in North Devon. And there are dozens of sightings that follow this route. But what makes them particularly interesting is when they were plotted, and they were plotted in the 1960s by a local historian. They follow all sorts of known roads and pathways, some of which don't really exist anymore. Some of them are ancient trackways, but you can plot this whole kind of route, which is particularly interesting in itself. And that's exactly the opposite kind of idea, because there's nothing demonic or mythological or any of those sorts of things about it. It's just apparitions of a dog that might follow you for a while and then disappear, but it's not portentous, it's not evil and these sorts of things, which most black dogs aren't. Less than 50% of black dog reports from the archives, when you go through them, have anything at all to do with demonic hellhounds or omens of disaster or any of these sorts of things. They're just dogs.
That's interesting of what you said about mapping the route, because I've noticed through my own research in this area, other researchers around the world will have with their particular places that they live. There seem to be clusters of these areas, clusters of stories or folklore in particular areas. Is that something you've noticed or tried to map?
Yes, absolutely. But you have to be slightly wary about the way that you look at that. So, for example, there is a very famous, if you're into black dogs anyway, a very famous map of black dog stories distributed across the UK, which was published in the 1950s by Theo Brown in an article in the Folklore Society Journal. And it shows these strong clusters in Devon, clusters in Somerset, clusters in Lincolnshire, and one or two others, which at first glance suggests that these are particularly strong areas for this, but they're not, because if you look at reports across the UK, they're very evenly spread. It's just that in the 1950s, there were only 3 or 4 people who actively collected the stories, and that's where they lived. And we didn't have the benefit of global communications back then. We had the postal system or talking to local people, and most people talk to local people. So you have to be wary about historic distributions like that and what they might suggest, because normally what they suggest is this is where people were actively collecting. It's much easier now, and we have great examples on the internet of people who do this and use pin maps to be able to record these things, and anybody can drop a pin in a map. Although there are some slight dangers to that, but anybody can submit stories, and then somebody who knows what they're doing can drop a pin into a map is perhaps a better example. And then we see these much broader spreads of stories. Mm-hmm. There'll always be a kind of clustering system inevitably, because lots of stories spread on a local level far more easily than through migration, but it happens. So you will find clusters, but you have to be careful about how you analyze them and look at, when they might have been collected is a good starting point for that, for example.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. So later in that summer of 2016, I went to a place called Hevercombe Gardens, which is a beautiful moorland garden that's open once a year as part of the National Garden Scheme for charity, and it's near Manhattan. And I went with my mum. It was a beautiful day. It's beautiful gardens, typical moorland gardens, granite, little waterfalls, heathers. They've got a little woodland there called the Faerie Wood, which they have some little fairy sculptures in, and you can walk through, and they open the gardens for this annual sculpture trail that they do. So they have these beautiful sculptures made by different artists. Anyway, my mum and I, one of the first things we did was we walked through the wood, and then we went to the cafe there, and right by the cafe there's a little private area of garden that you can go into that's just basically a sort of a paved area, and they've got lots of ornaments of fairies and animals and plants all together in this little small area. So I suppose we're already in this very fairy sort of space, because we'd walked through the fairy woodland, we'd sat and relaxed and had a chat, and then it's a very hot day, and then we'd looked around this little fairy garden. Then we went to look around the rest of the gardens. We were wandering around, and then heading back at the end of the day in a very relaxed state of mind. We were walking past this big log, and out of the corner of my eye, it would have been to my left, out the corner of my left eye, on the end of this log, I thought I saw a pixie, like a typical pixie. It was brown skin, dressed in brown, pointy hat, sat, and this was just a matter of seconds, sat with his knees pulled up, looking over what had been his right shoulder, looking over at me. And I just happened to say, "Oh, I just saw a pixie. Well, there's a pixie," to my mum, and she said, "Oh yeah, a pixie." We both saw it at the same time and just carried on walking. And I said, "Wasn't that strange?" And I can't remember what I actually said up to my mum after that. It was probably along the lines of, "I thought I saw a pixie there," and my mum said, "Oh yeah, I did as well," on the end of this log. So it was as if part of the end of this log, at the end of this log there was the remains of I suppose part of the tree branch that had been sawn off, that was sticking up a little bit. We'd both, in our minds, this end of this log this branch had morphed into this pixie that was sitting at the end of this log. So it was really fascinating. We both saw it at the same time and really magical. So with that experience, I think, followed the experience I'd had in June at Bisman's Wood. Yes, it did. It was after that. And then in the early part of 2017, my mum was diagnosed with cancer. So to me again, this experience had more significance because I thought we were both in this sort of relaxed state of mind, and unbeknownst to my mum, she was in this sort of liminal state of, life changing for both of us, really. We're both in this state of change coming up, and my mum had this cancer diagnosis, and suddenly I became her carer because she was very poorly. So then I'd had a really, really tough time caring for my mum and trying to get her some care. And then in the early April of 2017, I'd said to my son, look, I really feel I want to return to... my mum was staying with us at the time. She had some support, so she said, you can go. So we both got up early one morning in early April 2017. We went to Wood, me and my son, who's 10. I said, we'll take these crystals. So we took some malachite for the pixies, and that morning I'd been trying to decide which piece of malachite to take. Chose a piece of malachite, and I took some other crystals with me as well, some quartz. We got to the woods very early. We were there by 9:30 in the morning, so it was beautiful. I've never been so early before anybody else arrived, so we had the place to ourselves. And a little traffinch appeared who was quite territorial but seemed to be leading us. That's the way we saw it as well anyway, that this traffinch was leading us to go to the end of the woods where the standing stone is. So we walked up to the standing stone, and I said to him, we need to give this piece of malachite and these other pieces of quartz to the fairies here, to the pixies. So he found a tree which was covered in ivy to put this piece of malachite into. So there's like a hole within the tangled ivy and the moss on this tree, and dropped this piece of malachite down into this oak tree. And then we sat and had our lunch and noticed all the strange tree forms we were spotting. There was one that looked like Pan, there were others that looked like strange fantastical beasts. It's an amazing place. And I'd taken some photos of the tree, and just to record our little journey there as well. On the way out of the woods, I had a message, just randomly had a bit of phone signal, and I had a message come through from my sister, and she'd sent me a picture of a note that she'd written on the back of a painting that said, everything is going to be okay. And it was amazing, and a great synchronicity. I felt that we'd just been into wood, we'd just given these crystals and the malachite to the fairies of the wood and the pixies, and I received this message just as we walked out of the wood, within minutes, to say everything is going to be okay. I thought, wow, what a great confirmation is that of this reciprocal relationship that we can create with the other world, the spirit of place with the fairies. Yeah, I was very moved by that, and I decided after all this experience that I was going to call the pixie malachite, because of this connection with the malachite crystal, which has lots of wonderful properties and was very apt at the time. Yeah, and it's wonderful to experience that with my son as well. Yeah, looking into, obviously my interest is fairies especially, and looking at pixies and pixie sightings. Like you say, it depends on whether there was someone there collecting that data
Yes, and lots of that data will be historic. So you do have to bear it in mind. It's not the be all and end all, but it just means that you do need to do a bit of digging around to find out whether that might be the case. If there are lots of stories recorded in a particular area and they were all collected by Sabin Baring Gould, then probably that you're looking at that. If they've all come from the same source, then it's likely that that's a reason. Otherwise, just drill down a little bit and see what comes up.
What's your understanding of West Country fairies? Because there's different ideas, aren't there, that they were a race of ancient people, and then there's another camp of people that say no, they're spiritual beings. Have you come to any sort of conclusions about who the fairies might be?
It's very difficult in terms of folklore, which is the way that I look at these sorts of things, to pin this down. Now, we know that the concept of fairy is very old, easily pre-medieval, probably more like prehistoric in some senses. But obviously we don't have any kind of source material from back then to be able to work with. So we're always going to be working with speculation. And with that comes particular problems. There was in the sort of Victorian period, 18th, 19th century, say, a school of thought which kind of went, if it's on the moors and it's made of stone, it's druidic, yes. Which we know is not the case. Apart from anything else, the Druids are notorious for having no written records at all. But there were people who worked with this concept, and it kind of became embedded for a while. It's been quite kind of solidly disproven now, but these things stick around. And the same thing, I guess, happens in other areas as well, where we have these ideas become embedded, like the ancient race theory, the kind of archetypal folk memory theory, these sorts of things. They've all been positive, they've all been looked at, and they've all been dismissed as ideas, but they kind of stick around. And the way that folklore and these sorts of areas work is that ideas stick around because some people choose to follow those particular ideas. And that's absolutely fine. What you have to remember about folklore is it's not interested in whether something actually exists. That's a different school of thought altogether. Folklorists don't set out to prove that a ghost exists or doesn't exist. They don't set out to prove that ghosts are spirits of the dead. Don't set out to prove that fairies are an ancient race or diminutive magical supernatural creatures or something else. Doesn't matter, because what we're interested in is the experiences, the stories that people tell, the experiences that they have, what those mean for that person, what they mean for that person's sense of identity. And this comes back to what I was saying at the beginning about folklore imbuing people with a sense of identity, what it means for the landscape around us. So fairies are a notoriously difficult subject in this area for lots and lots of different reasons. We have to remember, ultimately, when you go back a long way, that the word fairy didn't refer to creatures, however you want to term them, at all. The word fairy referred to the believed supernatural realm in which other things happened. Fairy was only attributed to a diminutive winged or not winged or whatever creature much later on. So even at the beginning, we have ambiguity in this, because fairies weren't fairies. Fairy was a place, a supernatural place.
So this experience I had with my children in a place called Woods, and there's a hill fort there. It's a very ancient place. I heard a voice say in my head to go, so I took my children there in late August 2016. It was a warm, clear day. I think it had just been raining, so it wasn't too hot. It was just a little bit sunny. I took lots of photos as we walked. At one point along the path, my son and I looked up through the trees. We could see what appeared to be up above us, because the wood slopes up above the path. So this path we're walking along is kind of lower than the woodland, and there's a steep bank up to our left. And as we looked up, it looked like there were two little figures, I would say just less than a foot high, not very tall, and it looked like they were standing holding spears or staffs with lights beside them, like they were holding lamps. Said, I felt magical. It felt very powerful. He said the tummy of the figure in front glowed red. We both felt they were like little guardians. The bank was too steep to climb, so we walked on, and whilst we were walking through the woods, the path swooped around, and as we walked I could hear cracks of sticks in the woods where there was no one. So it's almost like we felt like there's this other presence with us. The path swooped around the foot of the hill, and I looked to my right. I could see what looked like a little gnome-like figure wearing a hood. We saw many faces of the fairies in the trees and banks. On the way back up the hill to the car park, we decided to climb the bank where we'd seen the two little figures to investigate. It turned out on closer inspection there were some branches and foliage that formed double interlinking archways. We thought these might be fairy gateways, and maybe the little figures we'd seen were fairy guardians or gatekeepers of these gateways. Yeah, that was an experience I had, and again I took some photos, and other people and myself looking at one of the photos, it looked like there's a little dark figure under one of the ferns, or under some of the ferns at the side of the path as we were walking in, almost like the guardians we had seen on the slope. So I really felt that this place is because it's ancientness, that the pixies here are very ancient. Fairy beings are very ancient and guard this place, very protective of this place. Maybe it's because there's the hill fort there, which is special to them. It's also got the river flowing through at the bottom of the hill, so it's very sort of energetically charged place, psychically charged place, I suppose. If I think of anything else, I'll let you know. I mean, I've got loads of journals that I've kept since 2016 that are diaries of when I go into nature and what I experience there with the fairy realm.
It's really difficult in these ancient examples, as I say, because the stories are so sparse. So Anglo-Saxons, Celtic races, they had these beliefs, but we don't have kind of records in them. We know that there were beliefs in different areas about these things, but we can't say exactly what they might have been about. And then kind of Christianity comes along, and the medieval period comes along later again, and then that's when we start to get ideas being more culturally embedded, I guess. So post 14th century, we find the word fairy being less used to talk about the land in which these creatures live, and we find it being used more to talk about these creatures. But then obviously in the medieval period, The church is at the forefront of everything. So then fairies instantly become evil because they're not God's creatures, they're something else. And then we have to deal with this whole concept as well, which all adds to the idea. So, the church was very much binary in these things. Things were good or things were evil, depending on whether they were, biblically understood to be of God or something else. But most people had beliefs that kind of sat more between the two, and that's where we see the kind of interest in fairies developing. In terms of the West Country, which is what you're particularly talking about, I think we see a few different examples. We see a lot of examples of fairies related to the land, because the West Country is such a rural area. So we find a lot of stories related to farming and helpful and unhelpful sprites relating to that, for example. Similarly with mining in Cornwall, particularly, because mining wasn't such a strong thing in Devon, but over the border in Cornwall, obviously mining was a very big thing. And we have all of the ideas of the Cornish knockers and fairies that either lead miners to a good seam of tin or whatever it is they're mining, or they lead people into danger or out of danger, depending on the stories. And this, like most folklore, the stories are very contradictory. So lots of our concepts relate to land use down here, and what was important to day-to-day life. So land, agriculture, mining, and then we have, particularly in the West Country, probably my favourite fairies, which are the pixie leading fairies that lead people astray from paths and things. And they relate to one or two different ideas in the West Country. So here we get those very, very particular things that are based on what the land is being used for, I think.
Yes, and pixie leading. There are so many examples of that, aren't there? And it's hard to pin down what was actually going on in those cases. And,
Yeah.
There's lots of derisive comments made about these experiences, but people still experience this strange phenomenon.
Yes, they absolutely do.
Yeah. Have you ever experienced anything that you can't explain? You'd say was supernatural?
It's hard to say for certain. I have seen evidence in the landscape that I suspect is strong evidence of out of place animals, but that's not supernatural. So like big cats in the landscape, for example, kind of gets lumped into the same area, but it's not supernatural. I've certainly had one or two experiences which I think are unusual and which people would term as being potentially supernatural. Hearing a voice where there is nobody who should have made that sound, for example, that sort of thing. So auditory phenomena, one or two examples of that. Olfactory phenomena, so smelling odd things in where you shouldn't be smelling particular things. That would be about as far as my experience goes. But I guess it also comes down to how you're tuned to think about things. And I'm very much tuned to think about things in terms of explanation or potential explanation as part of exploring why something happens. Not saying for certain, I wouldn't put myself down as being a hard and fast kind of everything has a rational explanation and I can give you that explanation in 10 seconds, because that's not what skeptical thinking is about. It's not what critical thinking is about, and it's certainly not what folklore is about. It's about a range of possibilities and not about evidence for a particular thing. So I've had one or two experiences which have potential to have, more out of place origins, but I can't say for certain what the cause of them was. But certainly nothing that I would say is strongly supernatural in the way that some other people would report it.
Interesting. Which folklorists have most influenced your approach to folklore and researching folklore?
think there are two for me who I would say are particularly influential for different reasons. There are lots and lots of very good folklorists, but certainly two who I think probably have influenced the way that I do things. One is Theo Brown. Theo Brown was a West Country folklorist. She died in the 1990s. She was particularly active between the 1950s and the 1990s. And she was not a great publisher of material. So my Black Dog book is based on her research notes, which were never published, for example. She published a book with Gerald Press called Devon Ghosts, which is quite well known. It is simply, if you think about any of the books that Peter Underwood put out, of which there are about 1 million, it is simply that. It is a collection of stories, no particular analysis or anything like that. It's just a collection of ghost stories. It's a great book. A couple more analytical works. She put out a book through the Folklore Society called Fate of the Dead, which looks at folklore related to death in the West Country. That's a less accessible book in some ways, but it's certainly far more of interest in terms of folklore analysis. But outside of that, the most important thing that she did was collect. And she collected masses of material. She gave lots of talks. She corresponded lots. She was very famous for her typewritten letters. And we have all of her material. If you go to the University of Exeter Special Collections department in the library there, you can access it. There are boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of it, all broken down into different categories: fairies, witchcraft, ghosts, far more obscure things, customs, traditions, all of that sort of stuff. And she, more than anybody else, probably gives us the knowledge that we have now about folklore in Devon through her collecting. So that is one person who I think is particularly important. The other one for me is a colleague of mine at the Folklore Society, Jeremy Hart, he has written a number of books, including a very good one on fairies, actually, explore fairy traditions, through Heart of Albion Press, I believe. And Jeremy just knows so much about everything. And he's one of these people who has that kind of brain that when he reads something, hears something, collects something, it lodges in there, and that's it. He can then instantly recall it at a moment's notice. You know, it's a phenomenal thing to be able to do. And the work that he does as a museum curator and the work that he does as a folklorist, and that's what he does these days. And he's very, very knowledgeable, very, very open with material and with offers of help and that sort of thing. And that's how it should be. And I think he's a great character for all of these sorts of reasons. But, you know, that's also a really good thing about folklore generally. If you interact with people online quite a lot, for example, you'll know that if you're working in particular fields, science, technology, history, all of those things, people are very, very kind of closed about their research and this sort of thing. You know, this is my work, you can't see it, I'm going to publish it, and then you can read it, but otherwise no, you can't have it. Folklorists just go, yes, here's my stuff, and throw things your way, and you know, they all do that because folklore is about this kind of, you know, material which belongs to everybody. Folklore used to be a compound word. Folk and law, 2 words. Folk, that's us, everybody. Law, that's our beliefs, comes from the Anglo-Saxon. So the beliefs of the people. You know, this material is not locked away academic study material. It belongs to everybody. And folklorists notoriously share stuff around. And that's why it's such a nice area to work in.
Yes, I mean, from my experience, I know you've sent me some material from my research into pixies, which has been really helpful, and other people that I've spoken to as well. It's the way it should be, like you say, because we're all trying to, from our own perspectives, trying to understand these stories this information from the past, and also to keep it alive. And that's the most important thing, isn't it? So that future generations can access this information, or present generations. Yeah.
Which is exactly why the Folklore Library and Archive has the constitutional aim that it does. It's to make this material available so that everybody can benefit from it.
Thank you, Mark, for your time. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Well, I guess people can go and find out more about the Folklore Library and what I do and those sorts of things. I can share those details if you like.
Yes.
So the Folklore Library is easy to find online because it's folklorelibrary.com. You can access the digital archives there. You can look at the library catalogues to see what print books we hold on reference. You can arrange to come and visit and all of those sorts of things. There's a contact form on there. You can send us your folklore, and you should, and your stories and all of those sorts of things, and we can add them to the archives. Other than that, the other main folklore-y thing I do, apart from my writing, is my podcast, which you can visit at thefolklorepodcast.com. Again, very easy to find. It's like 100 million years worth of episodes on there now, like 10 years, but it's been a while. Lots of material on there that you can catch up on if you haven't listened to it, including stuff on fairies and stuff on other things too. And you can find all my books on the online shop on there as well, and buy them and read about all of these sorts of things.
Thank you, Mark. Really enjoyed speaking to you today, and thank you for your time.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invite, Claire.